Hi, Phil Hogan from Hudson & Company here, and today I want to share with you a call I received yesterday from a gentleman who had some questions about late filed tax returns and unreported income. So the gentleman that called me yesterday, let's call him Joe, he phoned up, he was quite upset. A few years ago, maybe 7-8 years ago, he received an inheritance from an aunt of his in the UK. She gave him, upon her death, about $900,000 in a UK bank account. Over those years, the account earned interest, income. However, Joe failed to report that income on his Canadian tax returns. Not only that, he failed to report the account to the CRA. For those that have over $100,000 of foreign assets, you're required to report your foreign assets under Form T1135. In addition to the T1135 foreign reporting, obviously he'd have to report the income for prior years on his Canadian tax return. So how do you do that? Well, that's where the voluntary disclosure program comes in. CRA administers a voluntary disclosure program where if you find that you need to adjust your Canadian returns or you need to file late tax returns, if you meet certain criteria, you won't be penalized under the normal tax regime for taxes that are owing, possibly interest, sometimes they abate interest, and any other penalties that might result from non-filing. The T1135 form actually has a significant penalty, a maximum penalty of $2,500. So it's a penalty of $25 a day to a maximum of $2,500. So if you haven't filed the form in a couple of years, you reach that $2,500 maximum penalty quite high. So, you know, I think he was at, I think he had seven years that needed to get filed. So it'd be 7 times $2,500. So quite a significant penalty. So by going through the voluntary disclosure program, you should be able to, as long as they accept it and you're eligible, have CRA waive those penalties. So how do you enter the voluntary disclosure program? Well, first you want to ensure that you're eligible. So the criteria for eligibility under the VDP program, the voluntary disclosure program, are you would first need to have a penalty be possible on the filing. So if there's no penalty as a result of filing the late tax returns, you won't be accepted under the program, obviously. The second criteria, at least one of the tax returns has to be at least 1 year overdue, which in Joe's case, it definitely is. If one of the tax returns is not over, or if one of the tax returns is not over 1 year overdue, then you wouldn't be eligible for the program. You also have to make sure that CRA has not asked you for any tax returns, or you don't think you're under audit or review by CRA. If they're already looking at you, or if they're already asking you for tax returns, then you wouldn't be eligible under the program, and that makes sense. You know, it's not a voluntary disclosure. If they're already asking you, you're not voluntarily disclosing the information. They've already figured it out at that point. And the fourth criteria is that the submission be 100% complete. You can't submit 80% of what you would need to disclose and have it be a valid submission. You need to submit complete tax returns with every form that's required under voluntary. And you can't have used the voluntary disclosure program before. If you use the voluntary disclosure program in the past, you won't be eligible to use it again. So assuming Joe meets all the criteria for VDP, he would enter the voluntary disclosure program in hopes to have CRA waive penalties on the unreported income and the taxes, or the penalties on the taxes that would result from reporting the income, and the penalties that would result from filing the T1135s late. So Joe would have a competent professional prepare 7 years of adjusted Canadian tax returns. So you would do that on Form T1 Adjust. You'd essentially add on the income that was not reported for previous years. So in Joe's case, he had anywhere between $5,000 and $15,000 of interest income that had not been reported on the Canadian returns. So you would add that to the Canadian returns for each year. You would adjust the returns. Each return would result in an additional amount of taxes owing. and those would be submitted with the VDP, the VDP package. There's also a VDP application that would go in with the package. With the tax returns, we would also send in the T1135s that had not been filed. So you'd file one per year. So we'd have 7 T1135s, which would report the UK account to CRA so that they know that that Joe owns an account or has ownership over an account outside of Canada. So once those forms are completed and the voluntary disclosure application is completed as well, so that's form RC 199. Those would be submitted to the voluntary disclosure program in a couple weeks or maybe a month, depending on how busy the department is. They would send out a letter accepting the voluntary disclosure, and then what we would expect and what we would hope, a few weeks after that, or maybe depending on how busy you are, a few months after that, you would receive a letter being accepted into the program, and at that point they would let you know whether they waive penalties and or interest. In some cases they would waive interest, in some cases they don't waive interest, and in some cases they waive a specific amount of the interest. So having interest waived is kind of a bonus. It definitely adds up, but it doesn't add up as much as the 5% penalty. So you'd be penalized for overdue taxes 5% of the overdue amount plus 1% a month, up to a maximum of 12 months. So in Joe's case, although he will owe a fair amount of tax, he has the $900,000 account in the UK. He has no problem paying the taxes that he owes for previous periods because it was just an honest mistake. He didn't report the income. He didn't realize he needed to, and once he realized he needed to, he took the appropriate steps. We would hope in his case he wouldn't have any penalties owing once he'd apply under voluntary disclosure, because it feels like he would meet the criteria. So lesson here is, if you have unreported income or you have accounts, offshore accounts that you've not reported, using the voluntary disclosure program can save you a significant amount in penalties. If CRA finds out that you have unreported income, or they figure out that you have offshore funds and they decide to penalize you on their own, it's going to be very difficult to have any of the penalties waived. And we've seen cases like that for new clients where there's not much we can do other than perhaps enter the CRA, what used to be called the Fairness Program, which is now Taxpayer Relief Program. But in those cases, that's not often a successful measure. So if you have unreported income or you have funds outside of Canada that you have yet to report, give me a call. I'll do my best to help walk you through. At the very least, I'll point you in the right direction. So give me a call at the office, 250-381-2400. You can shoot me an email, phil@hutchison.ca. I'll leave contact info below on this video. And we look forward to speaking to you again. Thanks for watching.